Imagine losing everything you love most and being left in the hands of someone who only cares about money. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But what if I told you that this is the kind of situation that could happen to anyone? Believe me, when it comes to inheritance and power, people's true feelings often come to the surface, and they aren't always pretty. In the film Gold Digger Rob's Stepson of Inheritance, you will see up close what greed can do to someone. Get ready to get involved in a story where money turns family ties into a cold and cruel battle. Have you ever wondered how someone can overcome such a devastating loss and still find the strength to fight? And more, how can you maintain humility and altruism in a scenario where everyone around you only thinks about themselves? What happens when life gives you such a big twist that it makes you rethink everything you imagine for your future? I guarantee you, this story will show you the true face of overcoming, and perhaps make you reflect on who is really by your side in the most difficult times. If this story moved you and made you reflect on the strength we have to overcome any challenge, subscribe to the channel now. Together, we will continue to explore valuable lessons to turn turnarounds into opportunities. Activate the bell and be part of this journey of overcoming and growth. Renee has always been an ambitious woman, but no one could imagine how far her greed would go. After her husband's death, the house became a theater of silent tension. She looked at Jack, her stepson, with a coldness that cut the air. Every step she took through the mansion was a reminder that, to her, Jack was just an obstacle in the way of her inheritance. His look seemed to say, "How long until I get rid of you?" Jack's expressions, on the other hand, were a mixture of grief and bewilderment. He never imagined that, in addition to losing his father, he would also lose any trace of family affection. Renee's presence around him was suffocating, filled with cruel indifference. Jack tried to hold on to his father's memories, but they mixed with the weight of his stepmother's contempt. Each day, Renee's presence became more oppressive. Their silence was full of intention, and their rare smiles carried an irony that Jack couldn't ignore. When she passed, the atmosphere changed. She seemed mesmerized by the sound of her own ambitions, as if grief were something inconvenient, a small detail on the path to what really mattered: wealth. Jack, still fragile from the loss, began to realize that he was more alone than ever. His home, once a place of welcome and love, was now the stage for a drama of overcoming, where he would need to deal with his stepmother's neglect. In conversations with friends, Renee made a point of minimizing Jack's suffering. "He'll get over it," she said, with a casual tone that made anyone question whether she had any shred of humanity. For her, the word humility was not part of her vocabulary. The focus was only on the fortune that was about to fall into his lap. When asked how Jack was coping with the loss, she simply shook her head, as if his pain were an insignificant inconvenience. This made it clear Jack had no place in his world unless he was useful in increasing his earnings. Interactions between them were brief, almost non-existent. When Jack tried to talk to Renee about her father, she looked away, as if the memory of the deceased was something uncomfortable. "Life goes on," she said, cutting off any possibility of a deep conversation. Jack cringed, realizing that, to her, he was just another burden to be lifted. That feeling of helplessness made him start thinking of ways to deal with the situation alone, without expecting any help. Perhaps, he thought, the only way out was to embrace the pain and transform it into something greater, in a process of overcoming that, even though painful, would take him far away from there. The days passed, and the tension between Jack and Renee increased. He felt like he was being pushed to the margins of the life he once knew. His room, his last refuge, now seemed too small to contain his emotions. On the other side of the house, Renee paced the halls, organizing details of what appeared to be her next big plan, ensuring that nothing and no one stood between her and the inheritance. The drama unfolding in Jack's mind was real. His struggle was not just emotional, but also a matter of survival inside that house that, increasingly, seemed strange. One morning, Jack tried to talk to Renee again, this time seeking some compassion, but she was too busy with legal papers, preparing for a twist in the inheritance division. "You're still young. You have your whole life ahead of you," she said, without looking up from the documents. For Jack, this was a blow. She didn't care how he felt, and it was clear there was no room for empathy. It was a game of power and money, and he was in the middle of it. It was time to decide. Fight or accept the fate she planned for him. Worst of all, Renee didn't have to say directly what she planned. His gestures, his actions, and most importantly, his lack of action spoke loudly. Jack, try as he might, couldn't find a way out. With each new attempt to get closer, it was like hitting a cold, hard wall. He began to realize that the only way to save himself was to find strength within himself. Overcoming would not come from outside, but from within. And that would be the biggest challenge he has ever faced. The idea of humility, which he knew so well, would be his greatest ally. But how to practice this in such a toxic environment? As the days progressed, Jack felt more isolated. His father's friends, who had previously visited him frequently, now avoided the house, perhaps realizing that the mood had changed. Renee, on the other hand, continued with her routine, acting as if the world was unfolding in her favor. She spent hours on the phone, talking to lawyers and planning what came next. For her, Jack was already out of the picture. It was only a matter of time before everything was resolved. But Jack wouldn't give up so easily. The story of his life was far from over. Deep down, Jack knew something needed to change. He remembered his father's words. Always act with humility, son. But how could this help now? Altruism, he thought, might be the key. Maybe if he could find a way to act kindly even in the midst of chaos, he could turn the situation in his favor. He just didn't know how. But one thing was certain. He needed to find strength, because the storm was just beginning, and he needed to be prepared for the upheaval that would follow. After all, Renee wouldn't be the only one to carve a destiny for herself. With Renee moving further and further with her plans, Jack began to think about how he could regain control of his own life. He knew it would be a journey full of challenges, but he also knew that overcoming is not something that happens overnight. As in the great dramas that he admired so much in films, the internal struggle would be his biggest battle. And although he didn't know what the next step would be, one thing was certain. He wouldn't let Renee win without a fight. As grief took over the house, Renee only saw a golden opportunity in front of her. The wealth accumulated by Nathan, her late husband, seemed to call to her. The will was not just a document, but the passport to the world of luxury she always wanted. Sitting at the living room table, with the papers in front of her, Renee was already imagining how she would spend every penny. Jack, well, he was just an annoying detail, something to be resolved quickly. What mattered now was ensuring that nothing interfered with his access to his fortune. Greed, mixed with indifference, created a cold character, who seemed incapable of any form of altruism. In conversations with her closest friends, Renee boasted about the luck she had had in marrying Nathan. He left me everything, he said with a smile on his face. Her friends, although intrigued, noticed a lack of sensitivity in the way she dealt with the loss of a husband and the fate of her stepson. For Renee, money was more important than any family ties. The focus was on inheritance, and nothing else mattered. Jack will overcome, he's strong, he said, leaving no room for any genuine compassion. It was evident that his only objective was to ensure that the entire estate was under his control as quickly as possible. Each day, Renee delved deeper into her plans. Calls with lawyers became constant, and she barely left the house. When she left, it was for discreet meetings, where she discussed details of the will and the deadlines for receiving the inheritance. Jack, on the other hand, watched everything from afar, still trying to process his grief. He knew that, somehow, this was all wrong. He missed his father, and, at the same time, saw the emotional emptiness that Renee allowed to grow around them. It was a silent but brutal drama, where money spoke louder than anything else. Renee made no secret of her plans. On any given afternoon, as Jack passed by the living room, she was talking on the phone about how she would use the money to renovate the house, buy a new car, and, perhaps, a trip to Europe. For her, this was a turn of luck, a chance to live the life of her dreams. Jack listened, stunned, trying to understand how someone could be so insensitive. It was as if money had the power to erase any sense of morality, leaving only greed in its place. But Jack was beginning to realize that he needed to prepare, because the game was just beginning. Renee's coldness was palpable. When the family lawyer arrived at the house to discuss the inventory, she greeted him with a forced smile, while Jack could barely look at the papers. Renee, on the other hand, was elated. Every figure mentioned by the lawyer seemed to feed his thirst for more. "5 million, she repeated, her eyes shining. Jack knew this wasn't about him. It wasn't about the father they had lost. It was just about her, her desire for power and status. The room, which had once been full of life, now felt like a courtroom, where Jack was just a witness to the inevitable outcome. In the midst of all this, Renee did not hesitate to demonstrate her disinterest in Jack. "Are you okay?" she asked, without waiting for an answer. It was a rhetorical question, without any trace of real concern. Jack, in turn, was beginning to understand that, if he wanted any kind of redemption, he would need to find strength within himself. He couldn't count on his stepmother. While she discussed figures, he thought about how to overcome that moment of pain and helplessness. The humility his father had taught him seemed to be his only anchor in a sea of unbridled ambition. In more private moments, Renee allowed herself to dream big. She looked out the window of the mansion, already seeing herself in control of everything. "Maybe I'll buy that house on the beach," he said in a low voice, as if he were planning his next big move. Altruism was not part of her vocabulary. For Renee, the future was clear, a life of luxury, far from any obligations that tied her to the past. Jack, on the other hand, was beginning to realize that his life was being pushed off the rails. He needed to find a way to take back control before it was too late. With each conversation about her inheritance, Renee let a little more of her true nature slip. She disdainfully mentioned the idea of taking care of Jack, as if it were an arduous and thankless task. "He'll turn around. He always turns around," he said, without the slightest trace of affection. Jack listened from afar, his heart heavy with the certainty that he was completely alone in that house. The image of his biological mother, who had passed away years before, appeared in his mind. The contrast was stark, a woman full of love and compassion versus a stepmother who only saw dollar signs in front of her. While Renee outlined her plans to spend her inheritance, Jack began to reflect on his future. He knew he couldn't count on her for anything, and that forced him to think of alternatives. "If my father were here," he thought, but he knew this was a battle he would need to fight alone. Renee's focus on her inheritance became increasingly clear, and Jack began to realize that if he wanted to win, he would need to turn his own life around. Inspiration was nowhere to be found in Renee, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way out he hadn't yet discovered. It was supposed to be a day of glory. Jack was on his way to the long-awaited football championship, a moment he had dreamed of for years. The sun was shining outside, reflecting the excitement on Jack's face as he and his father walked down the road. The future looked bright, and his expectations were high. But as in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A bang, a break, and darkness took over everything. The car turned several times until it stopped, leaving a scene of chaos and destruction. Jack woke up minutes later, dazed, feeling the cold of the metal against his skin. As he tried to move, excruciating pain took over his body. And then the worst came. He couldn't feel his legs. The ambulance arrived quickly, and the paramedics did what they could. The sirens cut through the silence on the road, while Jack, immobilized on the stretcher, tried to understand what had happened. "Your father? Where was your father? Is he okay?" He tried to ask, but his voice wouldn't come through. Desperation began to take over. At that moment, what was supposed to be the peak of his football career turned into an endless nightmare. Jack was about to face the biggest challenge of his life, and he still didn't know how big an impact it would have on his future. What once seemed like a dream of overcoming now seemed impossible. When Jack woke up in the hospital, the environment was oppressive. The bright lights and the sound of the surrounding machines surrounded him, creating an atmosphere of tension. He looked around, trying to process where he was. It was then that a nurse came in, with a look full of concern. "You had an accident," she said softly. Jack tried to move, but nothing happened. His body, which had once been agile and strong, now seemed unresponsive. "I can't feel my legs," he mumbled. The nurse's words were direct but gentle. "You're paralyzed, Jack, but there's still hope." Jack's world collapsed. The words paralyzed echoed in his mind, repeating themselves like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He remembered the championship, the training, the mornings he spent striving to achieve his dream of being a professional player. Now, everything seemed distant, almost unreachable. The physical pain was great, but nothing compared to the emotional pain. His father had died in the accident, and Jack felt like a part of himself had been buried that day as well. His mind wandered, trying to find an explanation, a reason to keep fighting. Days passed, and Jack remained motionless in the hospital bed, looking at the ceiling, searching for answers that didn't come. Visits were few. Renee, of course, made quick appearances, her gaze blank, never offering words of comfort. Jack expected nothing more from her, but the absence of any gesture of support was a cruel reminder of his loneliness. The hospital, which was supposed to be a place of healing, now felt like a prison. The idea of overcoming seemed like a distant concept, almost a joke. He, who had always believed in the power of getting up after every fall, was now trapped in an unresponsive body. One cold morning, Jack received a visit from a doctor who would change his life. She entered the room with a welcoming smile, bringing with her a different energy. "Hi, Jack. I'm Dr. Brooke. I know you're going through a really difficult time, but I want you to know that there's a way out. I've been where you are now, too." Jack looked up, curious. She continued, "I was in an accident, just like you, and was told I would never walk again. But I got over it, and you can too." Her words lit a small fire in Jack. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. Dr. Brooke began to tell her story. It was a drama of overcoming and resilience, of fighting against all odds. Jack listened intently, trying to absorb every word. "I know it seems impossible right now, but you are not alone in this fight. I will be here to help." Jack, for the first time since the accident, felt a spark of hope. The turnaround he needed would not just come from medicine, but from within himself. He knew the road would be long and arduous, but if Dr. Brooke could do it, maybe he could too. As the days turned into weeks, Jack began working hard with physical therapy. Every move, no matter how small, was a victory. Overcoming was no longer just a word. It was a daily challenge that he embraced with all his might. The exercises were painful, and he often wanted to give up. But in the words of his father and Dr. Brooke, he found the strength to carry on. "Humility is the key," she always said. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Jack, just to yourself." Jack repeated these words every morning, before starting another day of battle. The relationship between Jack and Dr. Brooke grew. She wasn't just his doctor. She was his mentor, his inspiration. And little by little, Jack began to realize that there was more to life than football. He could be much more than a player, even if he never walked again. Her fight was about resilience, about finding strength where before there was only despair. With each physical therapy session, with each conversation, Jack felt that he was, little by little, rebuilding himself. And most importantly, he was beginning to believe that his future could be as bright as he had once imagined. Dr. Brooke was the kind of person who seemed to carry the solution to the invisible wounds of the soul. When she entered Jack's room for the first time, the previously heavy environment gained an air of lightness, as if her presence was capable of igniting a hope that he didn't even know still existed. "I know exactly what you're going through," she said, and those words, spoken with a calm firmness, were the beginning of a connection Jack never imagined he would have with someone in such a dark time. She wasn't just there as a doctor. I was there as someone who had already walked the same path of pain and overcoming. Jack felt, for the first time, that he was not alone. Dr. Brooke's story was almost unbelievable. She had been in a similar accident, and doctors gave her less than a 5% chance of walking again. "Do you believe that, Jack?" she said with a smile, trying to bring some lightness to the room. Jack, still dejected, didn't know what to think, but the fact that she was there, standing, recounting her own journey, was living proof that miracles sometimes happen. They were not miracles in the magical sense, but the fruits of hard work, determination, and, above all, an unshakable faith in oneself. Dr. Brooks spoke with authority, but her voice carried a tone of humility that was comforting. As Jack listened, something inside him began to change. Her words weren't just empty comfort. She had been in that same place, feeling the same pain and frustrations. "It's not easy," she admitted. "There will be days when you want to give up. There will be moments when everything seems impossible. But it is precisely in those moments that you need to be stronger." Jack shook his head, taking in every word like it was a lifeline. Overcoming for him began to take shape as a long but possible process. And now he had someone by his side who knew exactly how to guide him. With each visit from Dr. Brooke, Jack felt a new door opening. She shared practical tips, like visualization exercises that she herself had used during her recovery. "Imagine yourself standing, Jack. Close your eyes and see yourself walking. See yourself overcoming each obstacle, one step at a time." These mental sessions, according to her, helped the body to believe in the impossible. Jack gave himself over to these visualizations with an intensity he himself didn't know he had. Each night, before going to sleep, he repeated the exercise, focusing on each detail, feeling the ground beneath his imaginary feet. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Dr. Brooke knew how to balance the tone of the conversations. She brought a subtle humor that helped Jack relax, even in the most tense moments. "You know, Jack, I had this crazy dream of running a marathon. I haven't done it yet, but at least I'm back on my feet. Maybe you and I can try it together. What do you think?" Jack smiled, something rare in recent months. Dr. Brooks' light laugh was like a breath of fresh air, reminding him that even in the midst of chaos, there was room to dream. That twist in Jack's perspective was beginning to take shape, and he didn't even realize it. Dr. Brooks' words were not only inspiring, they were a call to action. "You need to believe it's possible, Jack. I won't promise you it will be easy, but I promise you I'll be here, every step of the way." This commitment was more than Jack could have expected. He began to realize that his journey of overcoming would not be lonely. He now had someone who, in addition to treating his body, was willing to take care of his mind and spirit. The relationship between the two grew, and Jack found himself, little by little, regaining not only his physical strength, but also his will to live. Dr. Brooke always emphasized the value of humility. "When I went through this, Jack, I thought it would be easy, that I could do it alone. But the truth is that no one overcomes anything alone." This was the kind of lesson Jack needed to hear. He, who had always considered himself strong and independent, began to understand that asking for help was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. Dr. Brooks' selflessness touched him deeply, and he began to think about how, one day, he could repay the kindness he was receiving. Perhaps, when he was stronger, he could help others in similar situations. Jack's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was constant. Each visit from Dr. Brooke was a step forward. It brought not only rehabilitation techniques, but stories of people who, like him, had overcome the impossible. We all have a strength within us that we don't know about, Jack. You just need to discover it. These words, simple but powerful, resonated in his mind during his physical therapy days. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but with each session, he saw small improvements. And those advances, no matter how small, motivated him to continue. Jack now looked to Dr. Brooke not just as a doctor, but as a mentor, someone who guided him along the path to recovery with wisdom and patience. "You are in control of your destiny, Jack. I will be by your side, but you are the protagonist of your story." These words echoed in his mind, reminding him that the journey was his. The inspiration she brought made him believe in his own potential again. And so, Jack began to see himself as more than a patient. He saw himself as someone who, one day, could inspire others too. Each day brought new challenges, but now Jack was prepared to face them. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't give up. Dr. Brooke had planted in her mind the idea that, even in the darkest moments, the light of overcoming can shine, as long as there is determination and faith. Jack was ready to continue his journey, not only to regain his mobility, but to discover who he truly was. Over time, The flame of hope that Dr. Brooke had kindled in Jack began to grow. What once seemed like an endless nightmare now began to turn into a journey of overcoming. Each physical therapy session was painful, yes, but it was also an opportunity to rebuild his life. Jack, who once saw himself as a victim of circumstances, now began to see a new version of himself, someone resilient, capable of facing any challenge. Dr. Brooke's story had become his daily inspiration, and he told himself, "If she can do it, so can I." This belief, which seemed so distant at first, now guided him in every step, or rather in every movement, that he managed to recover. There were times when Jack still felt dejected. On days when physiotherapy seemed to show no results, frustration came with a vengeance. He wondered if all that effort would really be worth it. But it was exactly in those moments that Dr. Brooke's words echoed in her mind. The journey is slow, but every little bit of progress counts. Jack knew that resilience wasn't just about continuing when everything is going right, but about persisting even when the path seems impossible. And so, he continued, day after day, with the certainty that his inner strength was greater than any physical limitation. Jack began to realize that true overcoming was not just physical, but also mental and emotional. During moments of reflection, he thought about how much had changed since the accident. Pain and loss would not define him. That much he knew now. His capacity for resilience went beyond his body. It was rooted in his mind, in his desire to rise again. It was as if he was rebuilding not just his legs, but his entire identity. And it was in this process of rediscovery that Jack found a new motivation. He wanted to inspire other people to also believe in their abilities, just as Dr. Brooke had done for him. Physiotherapy sessions were no longer just about exercise. For Jack, they became daily battles, where he faced his own fears and doubts. Every movement, no matter how small, was a victory, a step towards the life he wanted. The idea of humility, taught by his father and reinforced by Dr. Brooke, was what kept him focused. Jack knew he couldn't rush, that each progress would come in its own time, and instead of despairing over difficult days, he began to see each obstacle as an opportunity to grow. Her resilience, which was once a necessity, now became a choice. As Jack progressed in his recovery, he began to realize the impact his actions had on those around him. Nurses, physical therapists, even other patients all watched his progress in awe. "You're an inspiration, Jack," they said. He didn't see himself that way at first, but now he understood that his story of resilience could serve as an example for others. This realization strengthened him even more. He knew that in addition to recovering physically, he was leaving a mark on those around him, something he could never have predicted. As time passed, Jack and Dr. Brooke became more than just patient and doctor. They were now friends, partners on a journey of overcoming. She challenged him with each session, but also encouraged him with words of encouragement that went beyond the professional. "You're stronger than you know, Jack. Never doubt that," she said with conviction. Jack, who at first was only fighting for his own recovery, now felt that his resilience had a greater purpose. He wasn't just healing himself. He was proving to himself and others that with determination, anything is possible. Little by little, Jack began to accept that he might never play professional football again. And surprisingly, he was at peace with it. Life had taught him that there are many types of victory, and his greatest achievement would not be within a field, but within himself. He had become a living example that true overcoming comes from the soul, from the ability to adapt and find new paths, even when the old ones seemed to have been destroyed. Jack knew that life, full of twists and turns, had given him a new mission, to show others that resilience is the greatest of all virtues. Jack still had a long way to go, but he was no longer scared. Fear had been replaced by determination. He knew that no matter how difficult the next challenge was, he would face it with courage. Altruism, which he had learned from Dr. Brooke, was now part of his essence. He wanted to give back, to help those who, like him, were going through difficult times. Overcoming is a shared journey, thought Jack, and with that in mind, he began planning ways to support other patients, to be the inspiration he craved in their darkest moments. Jack remembered a quote Dr. Brooke had told him early in his recovery. "Resilience is not about not falling. It's about always getting up." These words became his mantra, something he repeated to himself at every physical therapy session, every difficult day. Now, more than ever, he knew his story was just beginning. What the future held was still a mystery. But Jack was prepared. He had learned that true strength came from within, and that no matter what happened, he would always have the ability to overcome any obstacle. Jack was ready to continue his journey, knowing that his story of resilience and overcoming would be an example for many. He looked toward the horizon with determination, feeling that, despite all the difficulties, he had found his true calling: to inspire others to never give up, to always believe that life, no matter how difficult it may be, offers new opportunities to those who have it, courage to fight. And with that thought, he prepared himself for whatever came next, knowing that with resilience and humility, he could face any challenge. Now that you've seen the power of overcoming, and how even the most desperate situations can teach us valuable lessons, the question remains: what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you prepared to face life's challenges with the same resilience as Jack? It is often in difficulties that we discover our true strength, but this only happens when we decide that we will not give up, regardless of the circumstances. And you? What are you waiting for to change your life? Think about the obstacles in front of you and ask yourself, how can I use this situation to grow? Maybe what you're facing right now is exactly what will take you to a new level of strength and purpose. If you like this story and want to continue learning how to turn challenges into opportunities, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you don't miss any lessons on how to deal with life's twists and turns and become the best version of yourself.